If you have a birthmark on the left side of your body, what if that mark is more than a random patch of pigment? What if it is a map, a worn scar from a life you once lived and are still learning to heal? According to the readings of Edgar Cayce, a man who answered thousands of questions while in trance, such somatic traces can function like bookmarks in the soul's ledger, reminders, warnings, and invitations. Tonight we'll follow that suggestion where it leads, through dreams, bedside readings, archive pages, and the strange lives of people who woke into abilities they could not explain. Before we go any deeper, a brief note of framing. Everything I describe here, the connections between marks, dreams, and past lives, comes from the body of material known as Edgar Cayce's readings, and from the way later interpreters have used that material. These are historical claims preserved in the Cayce archives. They are not presented as settled doctrinal teaching or medical fact. Some of Cayce's metaphysical ideas, like reincarnation and the Akashic records, sit outside mainstream Christian doctrine, and I'll flag those differences as we move forward. Treat what follows as an exploration of a particular spiritual framework, one that has shaped many lives, and that may offer a language for experiences you already carry in your body. Who was Edgar Cayce? The shorthand is familiar, a Kentucky-born photographer who, beginning in the early 20th century, entered a sleep-like trance and spoke in a voice that often seemed to have access to memories, diagnostic impressions, and future-orienting counsel. Over the course of his life, he produced thousands of readings, examinations, and directives that covered health, past lives, dreams, spiritual development, and even geological histories like the lost continent of Atlantis. Those readings were preserved by the organization that grew up around him, now often referred to as the Cayce Foundation in Virginia Beach. For those who study Cayce, the archive reads like a cross between an old medical file, a confessional ledger, and a metaphysical map. If that sounds strange, remember that Cayce himself worked in measured, often pastoral language. He framed much of his work with Christian imagery, references to Christ's light, to prayer, to moral responsibility, while simultaneously describing a layered, vibrational cosmos populated by soul lessons and repeat incarnations. That dual language is part of what makes his material compelling to spiritual seekers who still want a foothold in Christian vocabulary. But it's also why careful framing matters. When I say reincarnation or Akashic records in this video, I am reporting what Cayce wrote in his trance state readings, not asserting those things as universal Christian doctrine. The central claim we're working from is simple. Cayce's readings often connected physical signs on the body, scars, birthmarks, unusual sensitivities, with a soul's ongoing story.
Recurring dreams, inexplicable talents, chronic ailments, and even addictions were, in this view, symptoms of deeper soul-level patterns. Dreams were not merely nightly noise, they were diagnostic windows. Physical marks might be the body's way of holding memory, and the purpose of bringing these things to light was not to glorify esoteric knowledge, but to point the person towards service, healing, and reunion with the source of life. If that idea holds any interest for you, stick with me, and if you want to follow this exploration through the archives and stories we'll use as evidence, subscribe now. We dig into these materials carefully and respectfully on this channel. Cayce's model of the human interior relies on a particular reading of dream work. Across the readings, Cayce identified a handful of recurring dream patterns, dream types that seem to correlate with certain gifts, challenges, and developmental tasks. Over time, interpreters boiled these down into what many students of Cayce now treat as 7 signal dreams: flying, water, ancient civilization images, communication with the deceased, prophetic or precognitive visions, healing and medical dreams, and what Cayce ultimately labeled Christ consciousness dreams. Each of these dream types functions like a key. It opens a corridor of the psyche, and in Cayce's view, often signals capacities or unfinished business the soul carries. We'll walk through each of those dream types, and with each one, I'll tell a compact case vignette drawn from the archive's stylistic patterns, the kinds of lives that resonate with these dreams. These are not verbatim transcripts of readings, they are narrative reconstructions meant to illuminate the pattern and to help you feel whether the pattern might be at work in your life. 1. Flying dreams. For many people, a dream in which they rise effortlessly above the earth, gliding over trees, rising above rooftops, hovering over water, feels like freedom distilled into image. In Cayce's material, flying dreams most often correspond to psychic or intuitive openness, an ability to perceive things beyond ordinary sensory limits, to see patterns in people or events. But flying can also indicate a soul that has repeatedly incarnated with a vocation in mind, often teaching, often guiding, sometimes healing. The dream is activation, a rehearsal for being lifted into other dimensions of service. Consider a life like Margaret's. She kept a small, careful journal where she recorded the same flying dream for decades, first in adolescence, then again in bursts through her 40s. In waking life, she worked as a seamstress. She was reliably practical, shy, and deeply empathetic.
but after a particularly vivid run of flying dreams, she found herself intuitively knowing when someone in church needed to be listened to in a particular way. People sought her out with stories they could not bear to tell anyone else.
When Margaret sought a reading, what Cayce's interpreters often note in similar cases is that the dream did not make her into a new person, so much as reveal a latent trajectory. The flying image signaled an activation. The work she had come to do in this life was more about presence and perceptive ministry than about any external achievement. The gift was always meant to be framed by humility and service. 2. Water dreams. Water is one of the most ancient metaphors for emotion and the depths of the soul. In Cayce's descriptions, water dreams, whether crossing rivers, swimming, diving, or watching turbulent seas, often accompany reputations for healing, especially those who are drawn to forms of therapy, magnetic healing, or any modality that involves flowing attention. Water images can signal purification tasks, the movement of life through stages, and sometimes, especially when combined with images of sinking or being pulled under, unresolved trauma that the soul is carrying. James Thompson's story follows this pattern. He dreamed persistently of standing at the edge of a river, watching currents pull objects downstream. In his waking life, he became a physiotherapist who specialized in aquatic rehabilitation. People who knew James noticed a particular calmness in him when he worked, a steady, buoyant patience. In readings of this type, Cayce's framework suggests that the dream was both memory and invitation. Memory of past roles near water, invitation to re-engage that element now in service to others. Again, the emphasis was not on making someone wealthy or famous, but on reorienting them toward tasks that complete a soul's arc. 3. Ancient civilizations, temples, ruins, and the feel of places that no longer exist. Here is where Cayce's corpus becomes most distinctive and also most controversial. He spoke frequently of lives in lost continents like Atlantis or Lemuria. He described rituals, temples, and technologies that left an imprint on souls who would later incarnate with a keen sense for certain crafts, inventions, or spiritual tendencies. Dreams of ancient stonework, carved figures, or submerged cities were, in this reading, echoes of prior cultural membership, and sometimes of carrying forward responsibilities tied to those cultures. David Kahn's recurring temple dream is often cited by students of Cayce as emblematic. In it, he walked cavernous halls lit by an unidentified glow, traced bas-relief symbols, and felt an urgency to preserve a knowledge that had been lost. In his modern life, David became an engineer with a near-obsessive interest in preservation and systems that run quietly in the background. For Cayce, these dreams indicated a karmic ledger of obligations, talents that must be stewarded and responsibilities that must be discharged in order to rebalance prior mistakes. With the Atlantis thesis comes the ethical imperative that gifts should be used for common good, not domination.
Communication with the deceased. Dreams in which a dead relative sits across the kitchen table or a lost friend appears and speaks plainly can be among the most consoling and confounding experiences. Cayce's archive contains dozens of readings where clients reported nightly visitations from loved ones. In many of those cases, Cayce interpreted the dreams as genuine communications that could serve a therapeutic function. He often counseled that such visitations were not necessarily miraculous demonstrations, but were part of a process of soul retrieval and teaching. Mary Patterson's life shows how these dreams can redirect vocation. After she began dreaming of an elderly aunt teaching her medicinal herbs by moonlight, Mary found herself apprenticing with an herbalist and eventually establishing a community clinic that emphasized simple, plant-based remedies. According to the pattern in Cayce's work, the dreams functioned not merely as comfort, but as vocational reorientation, a guide pointing to a practice that integrates memory and communal need. Notice again the theme: dreams do not primarily inflate the ego, they invite service. 5. Prophetic or precognitive visions. Some dreams are less about personal development and more about future events: a house burning, a train derailment, an election marked with unusual imagery. In Cayce's readings, there are accounts of dreams that anticipated events with eerie specificity. Interpreters warn, however, that prophetic dreams in Cayce's frame nearly always come with a moral overlay. They are not toys for curiosity, but calls to attention, and sometimes to action. Eleanor Walsh's premonitory visions before an economic crisis are illustrative. She dreamed of empty store shelves and of faces lined with fear, and in waking life she became a coordinator of mutual aid networks that helped her community through scarce years. In Cayce's schema, the prophetic dream is ethical. It places knowledge in the heart of those who will respond by serving, rather than those who will profit. That distinction is crucial, and it will return as an ethical refrain later in our exploration. 6. Healing and medical dreams. These are dreams in which the dreamer sees bodies, anatomical images, surgical scenes, or experiences relief from pain. They often correlate with a calling toward healing professions: doctors, nurses, alternate healing practitioners, or to people who act as healers in non-medical settings: midwives, counselors, and spiritual guides.
Robert Chen's dream of a luminous cable surrounded by hands is one such pattern. In his waking life, he specialized in energetic work and became known for helping people shift chronic pain in ways that doctors could not fully explain. In Cayce's readings, such dreams are not guarantees of miraculous cures. Rather, they signal a soul's attunement to certain frequencies of care, a predisposition to sense what needs to be balanced in the field of another person's life.
The readings often emphasize training, humility, and referral to appropriate professionals when necessary. Cayce's counsel seldom encouraged reckless substitution of spiritual methods for medical care. 7. Christ consciousness dreams. This is perhaps the densest and most theologically charged category. Cayce used the phrase Christ consciousness to denote a mode of awareness characterized by compassion, surrender, and alignment with what he described as the divine plan. Dreams of walking with a luminous figure, of being bathed in light, or of entering a presence that simply knows and forgives are placed under this rubric. For Cayce, such dreams were less about literal visions of Jesus and more about encounters with an inner Christ-like center that calls the soul towards sacrificial love. Martha Johnson's repeated dream of a warm, listening presence that radiated acceptance propelled her into decades of community service. In her case, the dream became the moral engine for a life lived at the margins, nursing in underserved neighborhoods, founding a shelter, and mentoring young people out of cycles of trauma. Here again we see the pattern. The dream activates vocation, and the vocation is measured by service. After walking through those 7 dream types, one pattern stands out. Dreams correlate with capacities. Dreams orient the person toward a life that often cures not primarily through miracle, but through alignment. They reveal what Cayce's language calls the soul's assignment. Now let us return directly to the promise of the title, the left side birthmark. How does a small patch of skin fit into the archive's larger language of dreams, gifts, and soul memory? In Cayce's framework, the body is not merely a vehicle, but also a ledger. It keeps records, sometimes in subtle ways. Scars, persistent pain, and yes, birthmarks can be considered somatic echoes, physical reminders of incidents, wounds, or responsibilities carried over from prior incarnations. A mark on the left side, in particular, can be read symbolically within this system. Left side markings have traditionally been associated in many cultures with the heart side, the receptive center, the place of inwardness. For Cayce, a left side mark could indicate that the soul's wound concerns relational or emotional lessons that remain unresolved. To make that connection concrete, imagine a person who bears a faint crescent-shaped mark over the left ribcage. In daily life, the mark has been a curiosity, a childhood nickname, a dermatologist's note. But beneath that ordinary explanation, the cane of Cayce's perspective suggests a different story. Perhaps in a prior life, the soul experienced a betrayal that lodged in the chest as grief. Perhaps the pattern is tied to a failed vow or a misuse of an affectionate power. That physical trace is a memory, but also a beckoning. It says, remember, heal here, reclaim what was lost through acts of love and service.
Again, the remedy Cayce outlined is not a single cure, but a multi-pronged practice of remembrance and service. The person learns to surrender that which has become an idol, to reorient toward communal support, and to develop spiritual disciplines that open the capacity for relational repair. Let me be explicit about boundaries here. I am not advocating that anyone forego medical care, psychiatric help, or professional therapy in favor of spiritual interpretation. Cayce's own readings often recommended conventional medical approaches alongside spiritual counsel. When medical conditions are present, they require the appropriate forms of expertise. What the Cayce frame adds is a lens that interprets recurring vulnerabilities, including those that appear as birthmarks, as possible signposts pointing to deeper soul work. That interpretation can be integrated with professional care, not pitted against it. So far, we have surveyed the dream signatures, met archetypal lives that display those signatures, and begun to trace how a left-side birthmark might function as a somatic echo of past life wounds. But now a sharper question emerges, a question that will demand close attention in the remainder of our exploration. How literal should we take the language of past lives in a Christian frame of reference? Cayce used Christian terminology. He spoke of Christ consciousness and frequently urged prayer. Yet his metaphysical architecture, rebirth, Akashic records, Atlantean antecedents, sits uneasily alongside mainstream Christian theology, which historically has tended to deny reincarnation as doctrine. The ethical stance for anyone bringing Cayce's ideas into a Christian context is to treat them as interpretive possibilities, not as replacements for scriptural teaching. For seekers who are neither strictly doctrinal nor categorically dismissive, Cayce's framework can function as a pastoral map, a way to narrate persistent wounds and gifts. The left side birthmark becomes one symbol among many to articulate why certain relational patterns repeat, why certain gifts emerge unexpectedly, and where the next ethical step might be.
That step, repeatedly emphasized in the readings, is not self-glorification. The healing is circular. It returns the soul to compassionate service. At this juncture, the archive offers something else that is important to hold in our hands, the after-death picture Cayce paints. When he described what happens after death, he used imagery that sounds at once intimate and judicial. He suggested that death functions as an enlargement of consciousness, a reenactment or review where the individual sees the trajectory of their life with astonishing clarity, the so-called life review. In Cayce's language, there are meeting points where the soul encounters a presence of light, often framed as Christ, who holds both the mercy and the mirror. It is not a punitive scene so much as an educational one.
The review reveals consequences, mischances, and, crucially, the threads a soul must pick up in subsequent lives. Within that frame, somatic echoes like birthmarks can be read as residual points on the soul's roadmap. They are places the soul returns to until the lesson is integrated. We will return to the afterlife picture in more detail later because it has direct bearing on how one interprets a left side mark. If the life review shows patterns of attachment, betrayal, or guardedness that the soul did not fully heal, then subsequent incarnations may carry a corresponding marker as a mnemonic. That mnemonic is not punitive so much as pedagogical, a standing reminder that the lesson persists. The ethical question, again, is what will the living person do with the reminder? Will it be turned inward toward narcissism and avoidance, or outward toward remedial love? Before we move on to specific cases that directly tie marks to past life incidents, and before we examine Cayce's more controversial claims about Atlantis and returning souls, there is an important spiritual psychological nuance to stake out. Dreams and marks do not deterministically chain a person to a fixed fate. In Cayce's counsel, the soul's position is dynamic. It can respond to revelation. Dreams are invitations, not iron laws. A left side birthmark may point to an old wound, but it also points to the exact place where healing can take root. That is why Cayce's repertoire is so rich with practical prescriptions: prayer, dream work, service, attunement, and community support. The readings do not cherish metaphysical curiosity for its own sake. They aim to generate behavioral change in love. We are now approaching a tighter cluster of archive stories where the somatic echo and the dream signature overlap in ways that look like proof to some and like poetic narrative to others. People who come to Cayce's readings with marks sometimes received counsel connecting those marks to past life incidents, and the advice tended to be pragmatic: act in service, undertake spiritual disciplines, and use the gift in ways that repair what was once harmed. These moments in the readings are the places where skeptics and adherents most often disagree. Skeptics argue that the readings project a narrative on random features. Adherents report that the narrative offered coherent, life-changing counsel. What we will do next is examine several documented cases that fall into this overlap zone, lives where the dream, the mark, and the calling lined up in ways that changed vocational direction and relationships. In each case, we will ask the same question: did the birthmark function as a memory, a wound, or an activation point? And more crucially, what did the person do with that information? But before we turn to those particular lives, pause for a moment and consider your own body as an archive, not as an object of anxiety, but as an autobiography that sometimes writes itself in subtle signs.
The left side mark is one of many types of handwriting. It might whisper an old betrayal. It might be a talisman for a gift. It might simply be a birth anomaly with no metaphysical freight. The difference between those readings depends on the interpretive frame we apply and the ethical choices the person makes in response. In the remaining time of this first section, we will step into two cases that illustrate how Cayce's archive often wove together dream language, somatic evidence, and moral counsel. The first is a story that touches both the dream of water and a left side marking. The second blends an ancient civilization dream with a chest birthmark. Both are representative of the kind of material found across the readings: evocative, contested, and deeply oriented toward healing as service. The first case concerns James Thompson, the water dreaming therapist, who, as a younger man, bore a light crescent-shaped mark along the left rib. For years, he thought little of it. His recurring river dreams suggested to him an affinity for aquatic work, and he followed that trail into therapeutic practice. But as his career matured, his personal life remained a knot: repeated cycles of clinging to partners who could not reciprocate, a pattern of rescuing that left him depleted. In sessions with spiritual counselors who used Cayce's language, the left side mark was interpreted as more than a birth blemish. It represented a place where the soul's relational pattern lodged itself. The recommended work was neither magical nor simplistic: deliberate practices of boundary setting, prayer for the cultivation of inner steadiness, and vocational redirection toward professional service that taught him how to give in measured, life-sustaining ways. Over time, the combination of therapy, spiritual discipline, and community work shifted James's pattern. The mark remained, but it ceased to hum with the same compulsive ache. The second case involves a man we'll call David,
who dreamed of temple halls and bore a faint irregular mark over the left pectoral. In the dream, he walked among carved images and heard a hum of machinery and ritual blended into a single sound. In the modern world, he kept returning to projects that sought to resurrect ancient technologies, not out of greed, but out of the sense that neglected knowledge could be reframed for healing. In one reading, Cayce's interpreters recommended that David use his technical gifts to build equitable systems and to avoid fantasies of control. The left side mark in that frame was a place of continuity, a memory that the soul must transform by offering the talent in service rather than using it for domination. David's turning point came not through a dramatic revelation, but through a steady decision to partner with communities and to submit his technical gifts to ethical oversight.
These cases illustrate a recurrent moral chord. The archive tends to direct attention away from possession and toward partnership. The left side birthmark, when read as a past life echo, functions as a call to reformation that always points outward. We will pick up these threads in the next section, moving from representative cases into explicit readings where marks were discussed more directly. We'll also look more closely at Cayce's afterlife map, the life review process, and the Hall of Records imagery he used to explain why and how souls might carry somatic echoes into subsequent lives. Those elements will help us assess whether a left side birthmark is best understood as a wound, a key, or an invitation, and how that interpretation can be grounded in ethically sound practices of healing and service. When the archive moves from pattern to person, the language shifts from theory to tenderness. In a handful of Cayce's readings, and in many of the stories told by people who sought his counsel, what began as a curiosity on the skin became a living prompt for change. I want to be clear about the limits here. In the materials preserved by the Cayce Foundation, there are documented instances where physical marks, scars, and persistent pains were addressed alongside dreams and life patterns. Where the archive is silent about a specific left side mark, interpreters of Cayce often treat similar clusters, dreams, symptoms, and vocational urges as a unit of meaning. That interpretive move is what allows us to say, in Cayce's view, a left side birthmark can be read as a somatic echo pointing toward relational or heart-centered lessons the soul is still learning to complete. Consider a profile that recurs in the files, a woman in middle age who, for years, had dismissed a crescent mark under her left clavicle as a childhood oddity. Her dreams had been quiet but persistent, images of carrying water across long distances. Sometimes she awoke with the taste of salt. She came to a reading because she felt inexplicably that her life lacked deep reciprocity. Counsel in that pattern tended to be practical and moral rather than mystical. The recommended work combined inward disciplines, focused prayer or meditation aimed at cultivating steadiness, with outward acts of repair, volunteering in care ministries, tending elders, or simply learning the practices of healthy attachment. In Cayce's framing, the mark was a pointer, the work was the answer. Another recorded pattern involved men who dreamed of stonework in temples and who, in waking life, harbored either technological genius or an obsessive appetite for control. A faint discoloration over the left pectoral or flank often appeared in the notes as an incidental physical detail. Readers working in Cayce's interpretive tradition would translate the pattern this way. The mark is a sign that the soul carries a ledger from a communal project or social power that once injured others or misused knowledge.
The life correction recommended was not self-aggrandizement, but stewardship. Use the skill to rebuild rather than to replicate old hierarchies. Service, partnership, and ethical oversight became the instruments of repair. In other files, marks paired with prophetic dreams led to community-oriented counsel. A man who dreamed of empty granaries and bore a small left side birthmark was directed in readings to prefigure cooperative action, food distribution, mutual aid, rather than hoarding insight for personal advantage. The archive's tone on these points is consistently corrective. Extraordinary perceptions or lingering marks are not invitations to celebrity, they are invitations to responsibility. To take these examples seriously is not to assert that every left side birthmark has the same origin, nor to declare reincarnation a settled point of Christian doctrine. It is only to say that within the Cayce corpus there is a coherent interpretive architecture that reads bodily signs in relation to dreams and life tasks. For many who found that framing helpful, it offered a moral roadmap. The mark names a wound or a continuity, the life work names the medicine. That moral arc, wound leading to vocation leading to service, is undergirded in Cayce's material by a distinctive account of what follows death. He described a post-mortem process that is at once tender and instructive. The terminology in the readings moves between metaphor and metaphysics. Death enlarges perception. The life review reveals the moral geometry of one's choices. There are planes or levels of vibration that correspond to readiness, and there is what Cayce often called a meeting with the Christ principle or Christ consciousness, language he used to describe a felt presence that both heals and educates.
The life review in Cayce's account is not simple sentence or triumphal judgment. It is a participatory mirror. The soul perceives how its acts affected others and sees the consequences with unprecedented clarity. In that view, somatic residues like birthmarks show up not as punitive tokens, but as signposts that the soul continues to read until the lesson is learned. A left side mark in this frame may be a persistent node in the soul's memory, one of the small, stubborn places the life review will return to until the pattern is transformed. Cayce also spoke of a hall of records, a metaphor adopted from broader esoteric traditions and reimagined in his own voice. It was a repository of impressions, a vibrational archive where lives and their lessons are accessible. Cayce used this image to explain how a soul could recall skills and memories that seemed foreign to its current life. In that context, a birthmark could be read as an entry point in the hall, a physical coordinate that resonates with certain memories in the records. Again, to say this is to report Cayce's metaphors and claims, not to equate them with theological certainties.
For viewers with Orthodox Christian sensibilities, this is the place to hold both curiosity and caution. Curiosity about a framework that maps meaning onto bodily signs, and caution because mainstream Christian theology usually understands postmortem reality differently. The question that often emerges then is practical. What do people actually do when they treat a birthmark as a past life prompt? Across many readings and across the lives of those who follow these counselings, a pragmatic pattern appears. The work falls into overlapping domains: integration, discipline, and service. Integration. The person undertakes practices that bind the felt experience of the body to the compassionate intelligence of the heart. In Cayce's language, this could mean focused prayer, dream work to clarify images, or ritual acts of remembrance that translate into daily humility. Discipline. The person learns habits that temper compulsive responses, boundary setting, therapeutic engagement, structured service commitments that require reliability rather than narcissistic performance. Service. The person channels their gifts into work that benefits others. Healing dreams become reasons to study healthcare. Prophetic dreams become prompts to build warning networks or mutual aid systems. Technical aptitude that echoes ancient civilizations becomes a tool for equitable infrastructure rather than personal power. These three domains, integration, discipline, service, are therapeutic and ethical at once. They reorient desire and repair behavior rather than promising a metaphysical fix. That is a crucial nuance in Cayce's counsel. Power without humility corrodes the soul. Gifts left unmoored from service deepen old wounds rather than heal them. Within the archive, there are also direct, compassionate treatments for addiction and compulsion. Cayce's readings often interpreted addiction as a symptom of spiritual disconnection, an attempt by the personality to find solace in external stimuli when what the soul truly needs is reconnection. That interpretation must be handled with great care. Addiction is a complex multifactorial condition that requires medical attention, therapeutic support, community, and sometimes medication. Cayce's view supplements rather than supplants that care. Spiritual practices, remembrance, surrender, service, are therapeutic adjuncts that cultivate a new center of meaning and steady sources of belonging. People in recovery who found spiritual community and service often reported that the sense of purpose and reciprocal accountability helped them resist old patterns. The readings recommended combining professional help with spiritual disciplines that address the relational deficits the soul had historically sought to fill through substance or behavior. This is not abstract talk.
There are cases in the readings, narrative silhouettes rather than transcripts, where a person with a left side mark and a history of addictive cycles was counseled to join support groups, commit to service projects, and cultivate practices that reshape the heart's desires. The counsel was practical and insistently humble, small, steady acts of repair over time, not dramatic promises of instant salvation. The healing Cayce described is the healing of memory and habit. It asks for community and accountability. Another strand of Cayce's work that often draws attention is his account of Atlantis and the idea of returning souls carrying both talent and debt. Within this cluster, souls who once participated in advanced technologies or social orders that harmed others were described as returning with certain aptitudes and with a moral obligation to correct earlier errors. Interpreters who take Cayce seriously note that this thesis is metaphysically speculative and historically controversial, but they also point to a psychological truth the thesis dramatizes. People sometimes carry a disproportionate affinity for certain skills and a matching ethical burden. Dreams of submerged cities or temple architecture may be symbolic recurrences of previous cultural involvements, and a left side birthmark in this narrative can mark the heartache of an earlier misuse of knowledge or power. David's temple dreams and his left pectoral mark are a case in point. The readings associated with that pattern, again in broad interpretive terms,
pressed him toward community governance of his inventions and toward transparency rather than secrecy. The ethical course recommended in the archive is consistent: rechannel aptitude into repair, prevent harm by crafting safeguards, orient technical skill toward life rather than domination. If all this sounds like a metaphysical therapy, that is not far off. Cayce's approach treats spiritual interpretation as an instrument of moral repair. Dreams and marks are diagnostic. The response is moral and vocational. The archive continually pulls away from sensationalism and toward slow transformation. So what does a person do tomorrow if they carry a left-side birthmark and the idea that it might be a past life wound resonates? Here are practical steps that are faithful to the spirit of Cayce's counsel and ethically responsible in our own terms. First, record your dreams. Keep a small notebook by your bed or a notes app with a single page titled Dreams. Write down images, emotions, colors, the sense of movement, and any bodily sensations upon awakening. Over time, you will notice patterns: a recurring river, a recurring presence, a recurring temple, and those patterns will help you see which of the 7 dream types holds the most sway in your life. This is not fortune-telling, it is pattern recognition. Second, cultivate a daily attunement practice. Spend 5 to 10 minutes each morning in quiet focus.
A short guided attunement you can use tonight. Sit comfortably, soften your jaw, and close your eyes. Take 3 slow breaths, feeling the rise and fall of your chest. Bring your attention gently to the left side of your body, your left rib cage, the space over your heart. Imagine breathing light into that place. Inhale through the nose as if drawing cool air into the left chest. Exhale through the mouth and soften. Say silently or aloud, "I do not carry this alone." Repeat 3 times. Then, without forcing images, ask for one small next step you can take today that serves someone else. Open your eyes and write down what came. This brief practice is less about guaranteed metaphysical change and more about re-anchoring attention toward the place the mark names and orienting that attention outward into action. Third, seek balanced counsel. If the mark sits over a symptomatic area or if you have chronic pain, consult medical professionals. If addiction or despair is present, contact trained therapists or support groups. At the same time, find spiritual companionship, someone who understands both pastoral care and psychological health. Cayce's own readings often combined the practical and the spiritual. Modern readers of his work advise the same integration. Fourth, move into service that tests humility. Volunteer opportunities that ask you to show up consistently, kitchen work at a shelter, visiting elders, mentoring youth, are ideal because they require sustained presence rather than episodic glory. In Cayce's readings, the remedy for a history of misuse or relational betrayal was repeatedly steady responsibility. Service transforms gifts into repair. Fifth, study and train. If dreams point you toward healing work, learn the skills required. If dreams point toward prophetic sensitivity, invest in ethical formation that emphasizes accountability and stewardship. Gifts without formation are fragile. Sixth, journal for moral reflection. At the end of each week, write a page reflecting on how the week's actions moved you toward service, how temptation for ego or profit appeared, and what you learned. Over months, this becomes a life review practice in miniature. An iterative version of what Cayce described happens after death. All of these steps are practices of reorientation rather than promises of instant cure. They answer the ethical demand the archive repeats. The work of a soul is not to accumulate wonder, but to redirect it for the common good. There is one more practical tool worth sharing that Cayce often suggested in spirit: dream dialogue. When a dream image occurs, write a short letter to the image the next morning. Address the river, the temple, the luminous presence, and ask a question. Keep the letter brief. Then, over the next week, notice what actions you are moved to take. The point is not to fetishize symbolic answers, but to cultivate responsiveness. Cayce's counsel privileges the lived response over metaphysical speculation. At this point, we should revisit the theological tension with honesty. Cayce used Christian language, Christ consciousness, prayer, references to the Christ light, and he urged surrender, love, and moral service. Yet his metaphysical claims about rebirth and Akashic memory are not part of mainstream Christian orthodoxy. For people anchored in traditional Christian theology, the archive can be read as a set of spiritual metaphors that nonetheless resonate with the biblical ethic: repent, love, and serve. For readers who adopt Cayce's metaphysics more fully, the archive offers an extended cosmology that situates marks and dreams within a cosmic pedagogy. Either way, the ethical end is the same: use what you are given to help others. It is also worth naming the limits of certainty.
Not every birthmark is a past life scar. Some are genetic, some purely incidental, and some may carry no symbolic freight at all. Cayce's readings, when used responsibly, were personal and individuated. They resisted universal rules that flatten nuance. If you bring a mark into this framework, do so as an exploratory lens, not as a prophecy. Test the interpretation by measuring the fruits. Does the work you undertake lead to greater humility, greater service, and greater relational health? If it does, then the interpretation is serving its moral purpose. When the archive turns toward the end of life, Cayce's picture becomes consoling rather than fearful. He described a scene where the soul, facing the life review, finds both compassion and education in encounter with divine light. That encounter, rendered in Cayce's language as Christ consciousness, is not an abstract theological claim here, but an experiential pivot. The soul sees where love was withheld and where it was embodied. The life review, in his view, is a teacher more than a judge. The implications are radical and humble. The wounds we carry, whether etched on skin or lodged in habit, are not eternal condemnations, but openings for future repair. The left side birthmark, then, is not a sentence, but an invitation. There is a final ethical turn that runs through the archive and that we must stake out firmly: the danger of spiritual spectacle. Gifts, dreams, intuitions, the ability to heal or to foresee, are tempting commodities in a culture that rewards novelty and celebrity. Cayce's readings consistently warned against the abuse of sensitivity for personal profit. The counsel was blunt in its recurring formulation: wherever greater vision appears, greater humility must follow. The left side mark, whether read as echo or emblem, is therefore also a moral test. Will the person use insight to build themselves up while others are left behind, or will they embody the inconvenient labor of repair? To return explicitly to our title, if you have a birthmark on your left side, could it be a past life wound you are still healing? In Cayce's framework, yes, it could be. But that could is a doorway rather than a verdict.
The right response is not to chase proof or to seek validation in esoteric notoriety. The right response, across the archive and across spiritual disciplines, is to practice the kinds of small, steady acts that heal what was wounded: honest relationships, consistent service, disciplined formation, and professional care where needed. Before we close, I want to give you one easily repeatable practice to begin tonight, a brief attunement you can record or speak to yourself if the idea of the left side mark resonates. Sit where you will not be disturbed. Place your palm gently over the left side of your chest. Take 3 slow, measured breaths. As you breathe in, imagine drawing in a quiet, steady light into the left side of your body. As you breathe out, imagine releasing one small thing you have been holding on to: fear, shame, impatience. Say silently, "I will tend this place with humility." Then ask a simple question: what one small act of service can I do tomorrow that honors this place? Open your eyes, write down the answer, and choose it. This practice is small because lasting change is made small week by week. A last word about sources and responsibility. The claims explored here are drawn from Edgar Cayce's readings as archived and interpreted by students of his body of work. They represent one spiritual framework among many. They are not medical advice, and they are not presented as orthodox Christian dogma. If you are drawn toward deeper inquiry, consult primary archive material at the Cayce Foundation and speak with both medical and pastoral professionals as you integrate these ideas. If this conversation about marks, dreams, and the moral life has moved you, consider sharing a brief comment about a vivid dream or a physical mark that puzzles you, only what you feel comfortable making public. Your story might help someone who recognizes the same pattern. If you found value here, like and subscribe so we can continue to walk gently through these archives together. Whatever your mark means, know this: it can become a place of healing when met with humility, disciplined practice, and service to others.